You are listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast produced by Veteran Strategies and featuring conversations with fascinating and impactful men and women who have shaped our world, our communities, and our history. My name is Robert Vane, Principal of Veteran Strategies, and your host for our discussion. You are listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast presented by Veteran Strategies, an Indiana-based public relations enterprise, and sponsored by Garmon Construction, Leaders and Legends LLC, the Grand Hall and Conference Center at Historic Union Station, the McGinley's Golden Ace Inn, and NFP, a national insurance broker with strong local content. Our podcast is featured on the All Indiana Podcast Network in partnership with Wish TV. You may find Leaders and Legends at allindianapodcastnetwork.com. Thinking of starting a podcast or need to host a public meeting? Let Leaders and Legends LLC be your partner as you look for new ways to communicate your message. Please contact Chris Spangle or me at leadersandlegends.net. And as always, all our podcast interviews are dedicated to the legacy and generosity of P.E. McAllister. Thank you for joining us on the Leaders and Legends podcast. Our guest today is Giles Milton. He has written a new book about one of the most murderous men who has ever lived, and we'll talk about it a little bit. The book is called The Stalin Affair, The Impossible Alliance That Won the War. It's a marvelous account. He actually made me laugh a few times, which this isn't exactly hilarity when it comes to a subject. But Mr. Milton is a million-copy, internationally best-selling author of a dozen works of narrative history. His books have been translated into 25 languages. He specializes in writing books that illuminate perhaps something that hasn't received the treatment it deserves. He is zooming here from London. Is that correct, Mr. Milton?
That is correct. Hi. Hello.
Thank you so much for coming on the podcast. Your focus is on the Wartime Alliance, so it's not like a full biography of Stalin, but you subtitled it The Impossible Alliance That Won the War. Why did you settle on that subtitle?
Because the famous Big Three relationship, this is the partnership, the wartime partnership between Churchill, Stalin, and Roosevelt, really was extraordinarily improbable and then unlikely. And just to start with Churchill had detested Stalin and everything that he stood for his entire political career. And if you wind back the clock 20 years, back in 1919, just after the Russian Revolution, Churchill had sent British troops and weaponry to this new revolutionary country to try and snuff it out before it got up and running. He described the Lenin and Stalin and all that lot as a league of failures. His language was very colourful. He hated everything they stood for. And likewise, from Stalin's point of view, he hated everything Churchill stood for. Churchill was an aristocrat, man of the world. He ran a democratic system. He was associated with imperialism. This was an unlikely relationship.
Let's chat a little bit, give a little more background on Stalin, because I would imagine most of our listeners know a little bit about Churchill, know a little bit about Roosevelt. But when you read about Stalin's life and Stalin obviously isn't his real name, isn't it Russian for like steel?
Yeah, Man of Steel.
Man of Steel. It's not an overstatement to assert that there's absolutely nothing about Stalin's resume prior to the revolution that would make you think he would become a great leader.
No, he was from a very impoverished background, from Georgia, right in the backlands of the Soviet Union. And he was a gangster when he was young. He was from a broken family. His father was an alcoholic, used to beat his mother. He was a very unpromising material, I think you could say. But he got in with this band of revolutionaries And I think he found himself in his element. These were guys who were quite prepared to break the law. They were quite prepared. They were murderous thugs, many of them. And Stalin, I think, found himself at home with these people, and he could be as ruthless as he wanted. And this, of course, if ruthlessness would see him rise to the very top.
And he wouldn't be, quote unquote, judged for it. That was part of the mythia of the gangs, of the criminal activity that he was a part of. And we're talking about Tsarist Russia, the time of Nicholas II. Did Stalin spend any time in jail? Because several other of these revolutionaries were sent to the Gulag or exiled.
He did. He spent time in the Gulag before the revolution happened and before the Tsar was executed. And yeah, he had first-hand experience of just how horrible it was to be in the Gulag. But that didn't stop him then sending many millions of his own subjects to the same fate out in the east of Siberia in really grim conditions.
Where was Joseph Stalin when there are two revolutions in I'll let you say it, but there are two revolutions. Where was Stalin when each happened? And why didn't Stalin, or did he, because I don't remember, forgive me, serve in the front lines on the Eastern Front during the Great War?
No, at that point, if I remember rightly, he was actually in the Gulag at that point, couldn't serve. And he really came into his sort of fore once the revolution had happened and Lenin had seized power. And you have this revolutionary Russia was a lawless, it was a country on the brink. And Stalin, being utterly ruthless, comes in with Lenin's support and the support of the other commissars and begins to make himself one of the most powerful voices in the country. And basically what he's aiming to do is, once Lenin is no longer in charge, he wants to be the man who's running this new country.
If a historian or an observer in 1920 now, would you have been surprised that Stalin bested Leon Trotsky in the grab for power after Lenin's death?
I'm sorry, it completely broke up and I couldn't hear anything there.
No worries at all. I'll ask it again.
Yeah.
If you were a historian or an observer in 1920s Soviet Union, would you have been surprised that Stalin bested Leon Trotsky for control of the country after Lenin's death?
I think from everything I've read about Stalin, he was utterly ruthless. He was absolutely, when he set his eyes on a goal, he was determined to get it, and no matter what stood in his way. If someone stood in his way, he'd have them executed. It was as simple as that. He was ruthless, he was cunning. But as we'll see when we come on to the war years, the Second World War years, he was also extremely clever and shrewd. And what I found fascinating researching and writing my book was that an entirely different Stalin emerged from the one I knew, and probably many of your listeners know. We think of Stalin as a murderous tyrant who killed millions of his own people. We don't often see the side of him, which my team who was sent to Moscow during the war saw of him, which was a Stalin who could be witty. He was extremely well informed. He could be extremely pleasant with them, garrulous, clever. And so suddenly this different Stalin emerges from the monster that we are familiar with.
Fast forwarding to the beginning of the war, please talk to the listeners about the shock of the Soviet-German pact, the alliance between the Soviet Union and Germany just prior. So I think it's late summer, just prior to the invasion of Poland by Germany, which is September 1st or 2nd, 1939, and how this shock, Hitler, Stalin, two completely different yet somewhat similar forms of government, leaders, and all that. What was that like to the rest of the world when these two regimes came together?
The world, I think it's no exaggeration to say, was utterly stunned when these two dictators, Hitler and Stalin, who had detested each other, suddenly announced to the world that they've signed a Nazi-Soviet pact, a friendship pact, which brings them into the same sphere. And I think both in Europe and in America, there was a sense of utter disbelief that these two dictators had got together, because this had huge implications for the world. Because Hitler, now having secured his eastern frontier, that he was friendly with Stalin, he was not going to suffer any surprise invasions or attacks from Stalin, he could now do what the hell he wanted. And of course, within days of signing this pact, he invades Western Poland, and shortly afterwards, Stalin invades Eastern Poland. They divide up Poland. The country split in two, half of it's controlled by the Nazis, half of it's controlled by the Soviets. And this, of course, is the beginning of the Second World War, because Britain had an alliance with Poland. If Poland was invaded, Britain would enter the war on Poland's side. So this pact between these two dictators marks the beginning of the Second World War.
And Churchill's reaction, both to the alliance and the invasion of Poland, is typical Churchillian?
Churchill was as horrified and I think as taken by surprise by the Nazi-Soviet pact as anyone else. He realized that this spelled big danger. And it should be said that the British had tried to create their own pact with Stalin. They'd even sent people out to Stalin to try and negotiate some sort of pact with him. But behind their backs, even while this team was in Moscow, Stalin was secretly negotiating Nazi Germany. And so, honestly, when I say the world was stunned, I think really it took absolutely everyone's by surprise. And it really, this was the firing gun for the beginnings of the Second World War.
It's not many months afterward that, or let's say a year and a half, but months, Germany invades other countries. They invade Western Europe on May 10th, 1940. Churchill becomes prime minister, has to deal with the invasion of Western Europe, the invasion of France. France is conquered. England is alone until July 22nd, 1940, June 22nd, 1941, when the Nazis break their, I think it was a 10-year pact and their alliance with the Soviet Union. So leaving aside the Americans for just a second, how is Churchill dealing with the fact that the Soviet Union is aligned with Germany? Britain's only ally has been conquered. What are Churchill's thoughts? How is he going to win the war in that set of circumstances?
Britain is in an absolutely desperate state by this point. It's losing huge amounts of shipping at the Atlantic. The Nazi U-boats are hunting down British shipping and sinking it. The country's in a really bad way. And as you say, the whole of Europe has just fallen. It's been occupied by the Nazis. And Britain really is standing alone. London is being constantly bombed by the Luftwaffe. Whole areas of the city are being destroyed. Other cities as well. All the big port cities in England are being destroyed. This is a really desperate moment. And there are many, including Churchill, who are thinking, we can't hold out much longer. This is almost the end. So it's desperate.
And what is happening? What sort of aid is the United States able to give to Great Britain during this time before the German invasion of the Soviet Union?
Aid is coming in. Of course, Roosevelt had signed the Lend-Lease Act, by which America was going to supply Britain with food, with supplies, and with munitions. But a lot of the ships were being sunk in the Atlantic, so a lot of this wasn't getting through. And simply, it was not enough to keep the country afloat. And that's why I think Churchill was constantly writing begging letters to Roosevelt saying, we need more, please send us more. But at this moment, also, Roosevelt was playing a very delicate line. He did not want America to get involved in the Second World War. So he was playing a very delicate game as well, not wanting to push America into the war. It was a very tense time, and it was a very desperate time. If you were living in where I am right now in London, there'd be bombs raining down on me.
He certainly didn't want the United States more involved before the presidential election of November 1940.
Exactly.
He ran against a fellow named Wendell Willkie, who's from Indiana, not that far from where I'm sitting. The British did have their victories. But in your opinion, was there any hope of Great Britain overcoming Nazi Germany without the United States and or the Soviet Union entering the war on Britain's side?
No, I think it was absolutely impossible. Britain didn't have the resources, it didn't have the men, it didn't have the armies, it didn't have the munitions, and it didn't have even the basic supplies, basic foodstuffs. It was very strictly rationed. So, no, it's absolutely inconceivable that Britain could have held out alone. It might have held out, but it could not have launched anything like what would eventually happen, D-Day, which we've just been celebrating the 80th anniversary of. None of that could have happened without American support. And also, as you say, without what we'll get onto in a minute, is the war on the Eastern Front.
You took me right to it. So on July 22nd, 1941, the Nazis break their agreement, their pact, their alliance with the Soviet Union and invade in what was, I would guess, the largest invasion of one country of another in the history of the world. Millions of troops, tens of thousands of tanks and planes and artillery pieces. Bringing it back to Stalin, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to laugh, but we'll get to it here in a second. But the fact that he had a German deserter who said, "You're going to get invaded in 2 hours," that he had that person executed, I find is for some reason I find it like that. Yeah, that's what Stalin would do. That's exactly what Stalin would do. So Stalin, it would be unfair to say that he did not have some advance warning that it was coming. Is that a fair statement?
It is a fair statement. In fact, I'd go further. He had been told by countless people in very high-placed positions that Hitler was about to invade the Soviet Union and tear up his Nazi-Soviet pact, this friendship pact. He had information from spies. He had information from inside the Luftwaffe Air Ministry in Berlin. He had information even from the British, who'd actually, though they hated Stalin, had given him a warning that there were 3 million German troops massing on the borders of the Soviet Union. In fact, I'm looking at the date on my computer right now. Of course, it's the 21st of June. So it was this very day, all those years ago, in 1941, where 3 million troops, 600,000 armored vehicles were all massing on the frontier about to invade. And Stalin simply refused to believe any of this intelligence.
Why?
Because he did not believe, or he didn't want to believe, that Hitler was going to tear up this pact. And so as you say, when the first news from German deserters comes in, he says, execute them. He has them all shot. He will not believe that this is taking place. And it's some hours before the enormity and the gravity of what is taking place finally dawns on him that Hitler has indeed broken his pact. And possibly the largest land invasion in the history of warfare is now taking place on his frontier.
You are listening to the Leaders and Legends podcast. Our guest today is worldwide best-selling author Giles Milton. We're discussing his absolutely superb book, The Stalin Affair, The Impossible Alliance That Won the War, focusing still on Stalin. I love how you describe, and it's in other books too, but I love how you describe the Stalin psyche as it starts to become clear that the invasion is real, it's massive, and it's moving. Please talk a little bit about those first hours or first days when Stalin realizes that he's in big trouble.
Yeah, I think what happened is that within hours, the Germans swept across the frontier and they just were defeating absolutely everything that they came across. So these pitiful Red Army soldiers, everywhere they went, they were either killed or they were taken prisoner. The Luftwaffe was bombing indiscriminately all of the airfields, and thousands of Soviet planes were lost within the first few hours of the invasion. And when this news finally came to Stalin, he had what really amounts to a mental breakdown, I think. He left Moscow. He went into his dacha, his country house in the countryside just outside Moscow, and he refused to see anyone. He refused to take any telephone calls. He was in complete denial of what was taking place, having tried to convince all his commissars and the country as well that this would never happen, that Hitler would never break his pact. Suddenly, he's faced with the enormity of this. And yeah, he just goes into this sort of complete retreat mode and won't see anyone.
He eventually, if I remember your book correct, he does receive a group of people. Is it fair to say that Stalin thought that they were there to arrest him?
He was terrified when the sort of the senior commissars came to his dacha and banged on the door. He thought they were coming to arrest him and execute him. And they actually, we have vivid descriptions of them walking into the room and seeing this Stalin, normally this big sort of figure, all-powerful figure, sitting in an armchair, hunched up, looking like a totally broken man. It's extraordinary to read these accounts, and you just see a very different side of Stalin there. And what they have to do is they tell him, reassure him they're not there to arrest him. They're there to try and persuade him to take control of the leadership of the country, that the country in its hour of direst need needs a strong leader, and only Stalin can fulfill that role. And Stalin then, once they persuade him, he says, okay, I'll take control. He goes back to Moscow. And from that moment on, really, we see this old Stalin, this all-powerful individual returning. And from that point on, he will control and direct the war personally, not always well, it has to be said, but he will be directly responsible for everything that happens afterwards.
Was there a nascent or hidden cabal of generals or commissars who wanted to get rid of Stalin at this time?
I don't think at this time. I think when you read the accounts, you find that everyone was in such panic that I think this was, even for the generals who didn't particularly like Stalin, that this was not the moment to try and mount a coup or anything. The country was facing an existential crisis. There was a real fear, and justified fear, that the Germans were going to sweep everything before them. So they were going to capture Moscow. They were going to capture what was Leningrad at the time, now St. Petersburg. They were going to capture Kiev. It was looking like the country was going to fall into the hands of the Nazis. So this was a dangerous point. And I think at that point, all the generals rallied around and realized we've got to do something or we're in serious trouble here.
Is it fair to say that these are the generals whom Stalin didn't murder earlier in his career?
Well, you're absolutely right to bring that up, because of course you'd had a few years earlier, you'd had all the show trials, as they were called, where countless senior people and many junior people, but the senior people who'd simply been executed on trumped up charges. They'd been dragged into court. They'd been told they were traitors to the fatherland or motherland or whatever, and they'd been executed. A lot of the senior hierarchy of the Red Army had been executed. So there were not that many competent generals in charge at this point.
Is this where General Zhukov comes into prominence, starts to rise and be like first among equals?
He does start to rise. And it's interesting that he is one of the very few that will ever dare to criticize Stalin. He has to be extremely careful, because if you criticize Stalin, the next thing you are likely to do is face a firing squad. But Zhukov knew what he was doing. Although he was a brutal general, he also knew how to win battles. And so I think that Stalin did respect Zhukov and would listen to him.
Didn't General Eisenhower refer to Marshal Zhukov as my good friend or my best friend? Tell my best friend Marshal Zhukov I said hello, or something. When Eisenhower was president, I think when Khrushchev came over to visit, Zhukov was still held in that high of a regard.
Yeah, if you look at photos of Zhukov, particularly from 1945 when he was in Berlin, it's absolutely fantastic, because he's got this very broad chest and it's covered in medals, absolutely, literally covered. He's got medals even dangling from his hips. So many battles have been awarded so many things.
Which is interesting, because in Stalin's mind, would it be fair to say, to just continue for a second on the psyche, that Stalin's dominant personality traits were, you said ruthlessness, suspicion. I guess I would put those two at the top, that he was always on alert for a coup. And he didn't, as you pointed out, he wasn't shy about firing squads and show trials. And for someone like Zhukov to rise and be this huge hero, I would love to know, and maybe you can tell us, what was in Stalin's mind. Was he ever worried that Zhukov was going to get, quote unquote, too big?
Oh, yeah. And that's why he got demoted at the end of the war. There was a sense that Zhukov was the only person that might be able to challenge Stalin at this point. And Stalin he liked to humiliate his generals as well. Nikita Khrushchev, who, of course, became leader of the Soviet Union after Stalin's death, He was fighting as a general in the Second World War. And at one point, Stalin sent him into battle with a huge army to try and defeat the Germans down in what's now Ukraine. And Khrushchev didn't want to do it because he thought this was an absolutely stupid idea. But nevertheless, he was forced into it by Stalin and inevitably lost the battle, lost hundreds of thousands of men and tanks. And he was recalled to Moscow by Stalin, who some of your listeners will know, if familiar with a picture of Khrushchev. He had a very shiny bald head, and Stalin got his pipe and banged it onto Khrushchev's head, and all the ash tipped onto his bald head, and he rubbed it in, and he said that's what the Romans used to do when their generals lost battles, And Khrushchev would never forget this humiliation. And when Stalin died, and he made his famous denunciation of Stalin, he actually referred to this as being one of the ultimate humiliations of his entire military career.
The impossible alliance that won the war includes American President Franklin Roosevelt and the Prime Minister of Great Britain, Winston Churchill. What was their reaction to the German invasion of the Soviet Union?
Churchill was woken with the news on the 22nd of June that Hitler had invaded the Soviet Union. Churchill was jubilant. The first thing he did was light a big fat cigar, even though it was only 5:30 in the morning, because this was the best possible news, because Hitler was now fighting a war on two fronts. And this gave Britain a glimmer of hope that Hitler had overreached himself. But then Churchill had to make a decision that day. Does he go to the aid of Joseph Stalin? Does he come in and publicly support Joseph Stalin in the war? And that was to occupy him for much of the day on Sunday, the 22nd of June.
And Franklin Roosevelt?
Franklin Roosevelt was more cautious. Interestingly, he didn't give a press conference on that day, nor did he give a press conference in the days that followed. But he did, behind the scenes, he was preparing the way to start supporting the Soviet Union. He freed up a lot of Soviet money that was being held in American bank accounts. He was holding talks with the Soviet ambassador in Washington. So there was a feeling, I think, more subdued than with Churchill, but there was a feeling that this had fundamentally changed the course of the Second World War, that things were now going to change. And it was, for Churchill, more than for Roosevelt, this was a moment to be jubilant. It was a moment of great excitement because he saw this glimmer of hope.
Fast forward 6 months, on December 7th, 1941, the alliance becomes complete. Japan attacks the American fleet at Pearl Harbor. Britain declares war on Japan. The United States declares war on Japan. Germany declares war on the United States. Brendan Sims wrote a terrific book on that, about the German Declaration, a former podcast guest. So all the declarations, all these things happen. What is Stalin's reaction to the news? Because I know Churchill's that he never heard of Pearl Harbor. There were Americans there, and I want to get to that. And I think he said he slept the sleep of the saved or something. I think that was Churchill's quote or close to it. What was Stalin's reaction to Pearl Harbor?
I think Stalin was delighted by this news. Now, you've got to remember a number of envoys had been sent from America, notably Averell Harriman. They'd been sent to America to thrash out the Lend-Lease deal with the Soviet Union. So America, what it's been supplying to Great Britain, is now going to supply to the Soviet Union on a massive scale. So tanks, aircraft parts, munitions, raw materials. This is going to be shipped to the Soviet Union in vast quantities. So I think to have America formally in the same boat, in the same war, was very good news for Joseph Stalin. Joseph Stalin, all along, now from this point on, he is going to be hassling Roosevelt and Winston Churchill to open a second front in Europe. He wants them to invade and try and liberate Nazi-occupied France. Now, of course, that invasion will not come ultimately till June the 6th, 1944. But even in the last days of 1941, Joseph Stalin is saying to Roosevelt and Churchill, get your act together. liberate France, open up a second front to take some of the pressure off the Eastern Front, where, remember, millions of Nazi soldiers are doing battle very successfully with the Red Army.
Do you know author Andrew Nagorski?
I know the name, yeah.
Yeah, he wrote a book called 1941, The Year Germany Lost the War. He came on the Leaders in Legend podcast to discuss it. Is that a fair statement? 1941 is the year Germany lost the war?
I think it is. I think you could certainly argue that convincingly, because Hitler, as I said, is fighting a war on two fronts. And this is ultimately going to prove unsustainable for the Wehrmacht, for the German army. There's no way he's fighting this massive war on a massive scale on the Eastern Front. As soon as the Allies land on his Western Front, how can he possibly sustain this war? Yes, Hitler makes a fundamental mistake. And that is why Churchill was so jubilant when he heard what Hitler had done. He thought Hitler has just made a fundamental mistake that's going to cost him the war.
You are listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast presented by Veteran Strategies, an Indiana-based public relations enterprise, and sponsored by Garmon Construction, Leaders and Legends LLC, the Grand Hall and Conference Center at Historic Union Station, and the McGinley's Golden Ace Inn. You alluded to it a few minutes ago. We are with Giles Milton. He's the author of The Stalin Affair, The Impossible Alliance That Won the War. You paint this picture, and I'm going to call it a cast of characters. And that's not meant to be a slight, because especially in the case of Averell Harriman, he's one of the most important Americans of the 20th century. Talk a little bit about how the United States, how Britain got inside the Soviet Union, talked to Stalin, got him to be less paranoid, if he was ever less paranoid, and how the two Western countries worked so hard to build a trusting relationship among the three countries. Because the way you describe it, it's a miracle it ever happened. Only Hitler could make everyone get along.
This gets to the root of my book, really. So Averell Harriman had been sent to London already by President Roosevelt, who wanted to have an envoy who really he wanted a direct hotline to Winston Churchill, and Averell was to fulfill this role. He came to London in the spring of 1941. He virtually lived in number 10 Downing Street, the Prime Minister's residence, or in Chequers, which was his country residence. So Averell Harriman got to know Churchill extraordinarily well. And once the Soviets were in the war, and once America was in the war, Roosevelt wanted the same thing with Joseph Stalin. He needed somebody who could talk to Stalin, who was trusted by Stalin, who could go into the Kremlin, who could work alongside with Stalin. And he chose Averell Harriman. So, as you say, Averell Harriman became really the most important American, you could argue, in the war, certainly in the Soviet Union, because he's got the ear of Stalin, and Stalin knows that if he needs tanks, planes, weaponry, etc., only Averell Harriman can get it, because Averell can just call straight back to Roosevelt, get the president on the phone. So this is to make him an incredibly important person. And likewise, Winston Churchill needed somebody, and he chooses this man called Archie Clark Kerr, who is an extraordinary, eccentric maverick who ends up forming a bizarre friendship with Joseph Stalin.
Why would you say, we can guess, but why would you say it's bizarre? In the sense of, you're obviously right, but Averell Harriman, Franklin Roosevelt, didn't they go to the same boarding school? Was it Groton or someplace together?
Yeah,
and so they're East Coast aristocrats in the American sense. Churchill, descendant of Marlborough, right? All that sort of thing. So you would think that some of the people, Lord Beaverbrook, who becomes involved at a certain point, these men would turn Stalin off. But the opposite kind of happened, which I thought was interesting.
It's really weird, because the first meeting, real serious high-level meeting with Joseph Stalin, comes with Averell Harriman, a multimillionaire American, runs the Union Pacific Railroad, and, as you say, Lord Beaverbrook, who's the owner of the Daily Express, the world's biggest circulation newspaper at this point. So they're sent into the Kremlin in the middle of summer of 1941. And this is a bizarre meeting. You have two multimillionaires, representatives of a system that Stalin absolutely detests, and they're sent in to go and deal with this gangster in the Kremlin. And well, I have to say that this meeting began very badly. It did not go well. Stalin was in a foul mood. He insulted them. He was really unpleasant with them. But they had been chosen for a reason, that these two, they were charming, they were gregarious, they knew how to talk to somebody. And remember, they're coming with a list of items that they can supply to the Soviet Union, tanks and guns. And so Stalin, I think, suddenly begins to realize, actually, even though I might detest everything these guys stand for, they could be pretty useful to me.
What's the quote from Sir Edward Grey? America is like a gigantic boiler. Once lit, there's no limit to the amount of heat it can produce.
Yeah.
And was Stalin aware of, Churchill obviously was, but was Stalin aware of exactly the economic and industrial potential of the United States?
I think he was. And this is where you realize that Stalin, who, after all, had never left the Soviet Union, he did not know the world outside, or he had no experience of the world outside. He nevertheless had an extraordinary understanding of the world outside. And I think there's a telling moment, actually, when Averell Harriman and Lord Beaverbrook, they list the weaponry that they're going to ship over to the Soviet Union. Stalin's interpreter leaps out of his chair, throws up his arms in the air and says, now we're going to win the war. And I think that kind of is representative of exactly what Stalin felt, that if the Americans and Brits are serious about bringing all this weaponry in, there is a glimmer of hope. The war can possibly be won.
Because, and this is, I think I got this in Mr. Nagorsky's book, that when the Germans invaded the Soviet Union, somewhat ironically, because they wanted to get at all these amazing raw supplies and raw materials in the Soviet Union, wheat, oil, all that, that by invading the Soviet Union, they cut off the supply of hundreds of materials for their war machine because those materials were being supplied by the Soviet Union.
That's right. That's right. Also, Hitler was hoping to capture all the great industrial complexes in the west of the Soviet Union. What does Stalin do? And really only a dictator can do this. He just says to everyone, dismantle all the factories in their entirety and move everything east beyond the Ural Mountains where they're safe, and rebuild them, and do it now, please. Of course, he was a dictator. He didn't need to say please. And this was done. So this was part of the burnt earth policy, or torched earth policy, which meant that as Hitler's armies advanced into the Soviet Union, there was nothing. The factories had been destroyed or taken apart. The villages had been burned down. All the farms had been destroyed and everything. So the Wehrmacht could advance while it was a summer and late autumn and everything. They could advance. But once it gets to winter and there's nothing, there's just snow and ice and everything. Every shelter has been destroyed. And this is where they begin to face their first problems.
You mentioned a few minutes ago about the very first meeting, but one of the things you make clear in your terrific book is Stalin just didn't see people. So not only was it unusual to have these emissaries in the Soviet Union, but as I recall, like is it Sanford Cripps? Who's the ambassador? Yeah. Okay, he'd never met him. So the British ambassador to the Soviet Union was never allowed in the inner sanctums. So the fact that Stalin broke with his own protocol tells you a little bit about how much trouble he thought he was in. Is that fair?
It is completely fair. Stalin, he was a recluse. He hadn't been seen in public in the Soviet Union since 1938. So even Soviet citizens had never seen him. And you're right about the previous British ambassador, Sir Stafford Cripps, had repeatedly requested to see Stalin until he got a very angry note from Stalin's secretary saying Stalin does not want to see you. And so everything changes very dramatically once Nazi Germany is invaded, and Stalin has to start dealing with these people. And that's where this peculiar relationship, and I should say it was, I think, a genuine, quite warm relationship between Averell Harriman and Stalin, and between Archie Clark Kerr and Stalin, that they got on a personal level, because I think they understood the existential crisis that the country was facing, and that everyone had to pull together because that was the only way that Hitler was going to be defeated.
How soon after and correct me, Are there any written alliances between or among the three countries? Is it ever set down into paper? The Franco-Austrian pact of the 18th century, which again shocked the world, shocked Europe. But were there ever any, okay, here's our alliance in paper. These are our goals. These are our terms. And did that ever happen?
Yeah, no, it did happen. One of the first things that was signed was the Anglo-Soviet agreement. This was just days after the Nazis had invaded that Stalin formally signs an agreement with Great Britain. Although it should be said that, as I said, he was a recluse. He didn't sign the document himself. He sent Molotov, his foreign commissar, to go and do it. And of course, then there would be countless charter, the Atlantic Charter. There would be countless treaties which Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin would put their signatures to. And notably, of course, the famous Big Three conferences at Tehran and then at Yalta. Lots of people will be familiar with the Yalta conference, where the Big Three come together and they sign up to all these sort of rather lofty post-war aims that they have, aspirations, which, of course, Stalin signs, but has absolutely no intention of abiding by any of these treaties he signed.
Mr. Milton, you do a lot of interviews because you led me right into my next question. I'm sure you do this for Susanna Lipscomb or whomever else you speak to, James Holland, who I'm hoping to get on the podcast soon. Casablanca, that is a conference, I believe in late 42, 43?
Yeah, I think I'm a little hazy now as well.
It's December. Right. No, that's all right. I did a podcast about it called The Devils Will Get No Rest by James Conroy. And he talks about, so Churchill and Roosevelt had obviously met. Churchill goes over to the United States right after Pearl Harbor, stays there like 6 weeks. So they had met plenty. But you get to Tehran in 43.
Yeah.
How does the Tehran conference that includes Roosevelt, Churchill, Stalin, how does that come to be? And how important was it for Stalin to be seen as an equal with these two great Western powers?
You mentioned Casablanca. That was meant to be the first meeting of the Big Three, but Stalin didn't come. He was in the middle. The Battle of Stalingrad was raging and he felt he couldn't leave the Soviet Union. So Tehran is the first time they meet at the end of 1943. The Big Three, for the first time, they get together, and it's everyone on the sidelines is watching with absolute fascination. How are they going to get on? What's the body language and everything? And it quickly becomes apparent that Stalin is a master of negotiation and getting what he wants. And everyone watching thinks that Roosevelt and Churchill, while they're good negotiators, Stalin is winding them round his little finger. They're very impressed. And unlike Churchill and Roosevelt, who arrive at this conference with dozens of advisors and supporters and helpers and everything, Stalin arrives with Molotov, his foreign commissar. And this sort of sends out a signal that Stalin decides everything. He doesn't need advisors. He knows what he wants, and he pretty much knows how he's going to get it. So it's very interesting, both Tehran and Yalta, when you have these people watching, very senior diplomats watching from the sidelines, they're horrified by the naivety of Roosevelt. And by they all think Churchill's extremely eloquent and gives these wonderful speeches. But at the end of the day, Stalin seems to come away with what he wants.
Would you qualify the Tehran conference as a success?
I think it was a success in the sense that it reaffirmed that these Big Three at that moment were all on the same page. They all wanted the same thing. They all wanted the defeat of Nazi Germany. They begin discussing the post-war world. They're pretty convinced by Tehran that they're going to win the Second World War. So they're already looking forward to the architecture of the post-war world. And one of the, just to point out where Roosevelt, I think, could be seen as completely naive, is that they talk about the Baltic states. And Stalin says the Red Army will obviously be in charge by the end of the war, but we'll hold a plebiscite. We'll let the local people decide who they want to govern them. And Roosevelt says, oh, that's a very good idea, Joseph. That's fantastic. And what those on the sidelines are saying was, hold on, this is incredibly naive, because once Stalin is occupying a country, it's very likely that the plebiscite is going to go in his way, is what he wants.
How did Churchill react? At this point, it's pretty clear that if there's a hierarchy among the Big Three, that Britain is number three. How did Churchill and his psyche, he grew up in the time, was born in the time of rural Britannica and sun never sets on the empire. How does he deal with the fact that there's clearly a diminishing?
It's fascinating. He gives one little anecdote that he tells in his memoirs, which I think sums it up so beautifully. He said, "There I was at Tehran, sitting there with the great Russian bear on one side of me, its paws outstretched, and on the other side, the great American buffalo." And he said, "And in the middle sat the poor little English donkey." And I think Churchill was profoundly upset, really, that he realized that Britain was a declining power. It was losing its place on the world stage. And if you like, this was its last moment where it was going to play a really global role. Churchill was always an imperialist. He profoundly believed in the British Empire. And I think he senses the British Empire is crumbling and is not going to survive the Second World War. And one other thing, it's very important that Roosevelt was dealing in quite an underhand fashion, trying to do deals with Stalin behind Churchill's back. And this was a source of great annoyance to Winston Churchill, that his supposed ally, his best buddy in the United States, was actually trying to do deals behind his back.
Roosevelt was not a fan of the British Empire either. Is that fair to say? And he would have had that in common with Stalin. It's time to move beyond the 19th century.
Yeah, and one of the most shocking things I read actually was a private meeting. How we know about these private meetings is they had to have interpreters, and the interpreters kept diaries. So we get this fascinating glimpse of what's taking place. And at one of the private meetings between Roosevelt and Stalin, he said, "Look, Joseph, we'll sort out the problem of India," he calls it. "We'll sort that out without Winston." And if you think about the enormity of that, that's pretty shocking to be doing that to one of your prime allies in the Second World War.
Isn't there there's a famous cartoon, and it says, and there's like on a door, it says Roosevelt Stalin private meeting, and they have Churchill outside sulking because he can't get in. I don't know if you've ever seen that cartoon, but it's beautiful.
But it's very accurate. Another thing that Stalin does at the Tehran conference, he says, he claims later that it was a joke. He said, I think at the end of the war, he said, we should take 50,000 German generals and shoot them. And Churchill is outraged. And he said, "I won't have any part in this. This is sheer butchery. I'd rather you take me out and shoot me outside now than be party to this execution of 50,000. At which point Roosevelt interrupts and he says, "Joseph Stalin," he says, "let's not execute 50,000. Let's do a compromise and execute 49,000. And this is his way of really rubbing salt into Winston Churchill's wounds. It's a particularly underhand thing to have done, I think.
I agree with that. And you feel sorry for Churchill in a relative term.
Yeah.
But since we're on this subject, before we get to Yalta, which happens in February of 45, how Stalin treats Churchill is a hell of a lot different than how Stalin treats Roosevelt. Do you agree with that statement? And how does that manifest itself?
I do agree with that. And I think Stalin was constantly belittling Churchill, constantly putting him down. At one extraordinary banquet, he starts talking about the Gallipoli campaign from the First World War, which of course was a total disaster for the British and the Australian and New Zealand troops. And he actually says publicly in front of everyone that it failed due to gross stupidities in planning and execution, knowing full well that this was the plan of Winston Churchill in the First World War. So it's extraordinary. Yeah, he went out of his way to try and humiliate Churchill wherever possible. And yet there were moments when they got on as well. It was a peculiar relationship. And the British ambassador, Archie Clark-Hare, is studying it with great interest. And he says something very interesting. He said, "I think that these two men, they just want to be liked. It's peculiar. They both want each other to like the other." He felt they were both really needy individuals, which is a peculiar thing to say about two of the three most powerful men in the world.
A politician is a politician. How did Stalin treat Roosevelt? Because it's clear, not only in your book, but in others, Stalin didn't play with Roosevelt. He held him in high regard, or even if he didn't hold him in high regard in private matters, in public, when everyone's around, He gave him great respect.
I do think he respected Roosevelt, perhaps not even personally. He respected what Roosevelt represented, which was the industrial might of America at the time. Some people say that Roosevelt sat there like a benevolent uncle. He'd be at the table like he can give out whatever gifts are needed for the Soviet Union. But I think he did play that role. And I think that's why also Stalin so respected Averell Harriman, because he knew that he was a direct envoy of Roosevelt, and he knew that these guys could bring him what he wanted. He was profoundly respectful of the might of America and the industrial production of America. And he said on countless occasions, I just wish we could be producing these quantities of weaponry. So yes, he respected Roosevelt for what he stood for and what he represented.
And considering that whatever the United States was producing for itself in Europe and producing for Great Britain and the Soviet Union in Europe, it was also producing the greatest fleet in the history of the world, thousands of miles away. It really is an astonishing achievement. I hate to sound like a brother Jonathan over here across the pond, but it really was. You mentioned a few folks, Kerr, Harriman, Beaverbrook, but there were others. And I specifically want to ask you about the women who were part of this cast of characters, this great play. Who were some of the women who had real influence in how their men or male officials interacted and reacted with Stalin during the war?
It was one of the women that got me onto this book in the first place, because I was told of a collection of letters in private hands which had been written by Cathy Harriman, so Averell Harriman's daughter, who was in 1941, she was 23, she was extremely rich, she was extremely intelligent, she was very vivacious, and she accompanied her father, first of all, to London, where they lived with Winston Churchill for the almost 2 years and got to know Churchill intimately. And then she accompanied her father as his aide to the Soviet Union and got to meet Stalin regularly and all his commissars. And what is fascinating about Cathy Harriman is she wrote some 200, 300 letters home to her sister in New York, letters which went through the diplomatic bag, so they weren't censored. So she wrote exactly what was taking place behind the scenes, what it was like to meet with Churchill, what it was like to be with Stalin, what the commissars were like. So we get a fascinating behind the scenes, a sort of glimpse of a world you never normally find in history books recounted, is what was taking place in the Kremlin, the highs and the lows of the war. For example, you mentioned Pearl Harbor earlier. Cathy Harriman was in Chequers, that's the Prime Minister's residence in Great Britain, on the night of Pearl Harbor. She describes exactly what happened. Churchill jumping up from his armchair, jubilant that Japan has bombed Pearl Harbor, knowing it will bring America into the war. She describes Churchill running to the telephone, ringing Roosevelt, asking Roosevelt what's happened. And it's all an incredibly vivid and colourful account. And for a historian like myself to have access to this, because the Harriman family allowed me access to all of these letters, was just a fascinating resource. It's every historian's dream to have a box full of papers which people haven't looked through, giving a unique peek behind the curtains, if you like, of what's taking place in Joseph Stalin's study.
Churchill and Stalin have a meeting. Churchill flies over to the Soviet Union, and they do a little bit of 18th century carving of other nations.
Yes.
Tell us about that meeting, please, and exactly what both men were trying to accomplish when they drew their own geographic lines in Europe for what's going to happen after the war.
So we've mentioned Roosevelt trying to do deals behind Churchill's back with Stalin. As you say, Churchill flies to Moscow in 1944, armed with what he describes as a naughty document. And it was indeed a very naughty document, because what he proposes is, he says, look, Joseph, let's not deal. Let's forget about Roosevelt. Let's carve up Europe between us. He said, look, you probably want Romania and Bulgaria, so you can have them after the war. But we want Greece and other places. And they have this private meeting. It's just Stalin, Churchill, and an interpreter. And we are very lucky, because that interpreter kept a detailed account of everything that took place that night. And it's absolutely fascinating. And it gives you an idea. I think a lot of us humble mortals don't realize quite how these things take place. but they are the great men simply carving up the world without consulting. Churchill hasn't consulted his own parliament. He hasn't consulted the British people. He hasn't consulted anyone in Eastern Europe or Greece or Romania or Bulgaria about what he's proposing. He simply sits down with Joseph Stalin and says, this is what we're going to do. Really quite shocking to read this, actually.
And did both men get what they wanted?
They do this deal, and Averell comes to hear about this, and he's absolutely horrified, and then informs President Roosevelt about it. And actually, what Churchill proposed to Stalin, which Stalin was very willing to sign up to, it should be said. Of course, by the time actually they come to sit down and plan the future of the world at Yalta, of course, everything's moved on. And in fact, by that point, the Red Army is in possession of most of these countries that Stalin so covets. And so the naughty document has really, it's been superseded by what's taking place on the ground.
Yalta is the final conference among this big three, Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin, commences in February 1945 and in the Crimea. Is that right? Yalta is a town in the Crimea in the then Soviet Union. It's perhaps the most controversial summit in the history of the 20th century. Maybe Versailles beats it. But over here in the United States, especially in the context of the Cold War, Yalta is seen as a place where Stalin really runs roughshod, gets what he wants, because Franklin Roosevelt is so ill, dies just 2 months afterward. How would you characterize the Yalta Conference in general and Stalin's performance specifically?
Like you say, the Yalta Conference, the purpose of it was to plan the architecture of the post-war world. Who gets what? It's dividing up the spoils of war. And as you rightly say, some people might be familiar. There's very famous photos that you find all over the internet now of the big three. You've got Churchill, Stalin, and Roosevelt sitting there in their chairs. And you just have to look at the photo of Roosevelt, even in black and white. He looks terrible. He looks really ill. And as you say, he will die a few months later. So he was not on form, I think, at that conference. And even at one of the dinners, he has to be carried out. He's virtually unconscious and holds some of his meetings in bed. And Churchill, likewise, is almost a shadow of his former self. He's aging by this point. He's drinking heavily. As one of his aides says, he was drinking bucketfuls of Caucasian champagne. He was drinking far too much. These two guys, they were worn out, and yet Stalin comes along. And Stalin is victorious by this point. Look at the Red Army. It's occupying Eastern Europe. It's pushing into Central Europe. It's pushing into Germany. It's pushing towards Berlin. Stalin is victorious, and he knows pretty much he's going to get what he wants. And so while the conference ends on a sort of very positive note, and everyone thinks people like Harry Hopkins, who a lot of people will know his name in America, he comes away, he said, we really thought we'd secured the future of the world. There was a great spirit of optimism at that conference. And yet it's not going to work out like that, because Stalin knows he's got what he wants, and he is a brilliant performer. Everyone who watches him, from Hopkins to Harriman to all the British observers, they say, my God, Stalin, he may be a mass murderer, but he knows how to get what he wants.
He insisted Roosevelt sit in the middle for the pictures. He insisted that Roosevelt, as the only head of state there, preside over the conference. He really knew how to make Roosevelt feel like he's the leader of the world. And Stalin, to me, at the end of your book and other books, you realize what a consummate politician. He's also a survivor, and he's also a mass murderer.
Yeah.
But what a politician he is, for better or worse.
And it's fascinating that Averell, at the end of his tenure in the Soviet Union, he writes a kind of an appraisal of Stalin. And he says, for me, Stalin was the most effective of the war leaders, much more effective than Roosevelt, much more effective than Winston Churchill. He said, to me, he was always courteous. He was always charming. He always treated me with great respect. He said, and yet I knew this was a mass murderer. And he said, actually, he remains one of the most enigmatic characters I ever met. I simply can't square the circle that someone so charming and courteous has murdered tens of millions of his own people.
Literally tens of millions of his own.
Yeah.
And Harriman goes on to be a counselor to Republican and Democrat presidents for another several decades. He ends up marrying Churchill's ex-daughter-in-law. I think I have that right.
And actually, if we could just say 2 lines about that, because this tells you how charismatic and extraordinary Averell Harriman was within a couple of weeks of coming to London in 1941 and living in the Churchill's household. He's sleeping with Churchill's daughter-in-law, Pamela Churchill. Absolutely extraordinary. The chutzpah of the man is quite incredible.
And then we should add, because then I'm going to go on to the 5 questions we ask all of our guests. Pamela Churchill, Digby, Harriman, whatever it was, becomes ambassador to France under the Clinton administration.
Many years later. And here's an interesting story. So Harriman and Pamela get back together I think it's in the 70s, when they are both single by that point. They meet by chance at a New York dinner party. And they think, we're both single, we're both fond of each other, let's get together again. And they do, and they get married. And they've wondered all their lives, if Clementine Churchill, Winston's wife, whether she ever knew about the affair taking place back in the wartime. So they write her a letter and they say, we're getting married. And Clementine Churchill writes a letter back and she just says, an old flame rekindled. So clearly the Churchills knew exactly what was taking place in the bedroom of their own house.
Sir Winston did like his gossip.
He did like his gossip. And also he knew that Randolph Churchill, his son, who was married to Pamela, was a terrible alcoholic wastrel. He had some sympathy.
I love that. I love that British term, wastrel. We have reached the point in the Leaders and Legends podcast where we ask the same 5 questions of all of our guests. Mr. Giles Milton, are you ready?
Oh my God. Now you're going to put me on the spot. I'm terrified.
Oh, you and all of your John Bull compatriots knock these out of the park. You will be just fine. What was your first job?
My first job was, going back a long way. I worked for British Telecom. While I was at university, to earn some money, I worked for British Telecom, which was a telecommunications company. And we had a phonetic alphabet, which we had to use. And we decided to play around there with this because it was very boring. And so we found words where the first letter did not sound. So you'd say to people, is that P for pterodactyl, which is a dinosaur? And it's really confused people. I got sacked.
What was your first concert?
My first concert. Oh, God, that's taken me right back. Concerts, school concerts, singing carols and that sort of thing. Yeah, no, all very British. We love that sort of stuff over here at Christmas. All very nice and everyone gets very festive.
I believe it was Helen Rappaport who told me her first concert was at a pub and she went to go see the Beatles.
Oh, that's quite cool. I wish I could match that. God.
Before, she said, just about a year or so before they hit it super big. Number 3, if you could suggest any book for someone to read, which book would you recommend?
Oh, that's a tricky one. But I have to say a book which is contemporary, which has just come out and is a huge bestseller, but I've thoroughly enjoyed, is The Wager.
Please tell more.
Do you know that or not? I don't know if you've come across it. Oh, is it by David Glantz? It's an extraordinary story of a shipwreck or sort of multiple shipwrecks, actually, and mutiny and survival and adventure. It's a fabulous tale and a cracking yarn. It's really great.
Number 4, if you could witness any event in history, be there in person as it happens, which event would you choose?
Oh, that is interesting. You know what? Staying on a theme, I think I'd be there at Yalta, actually. I'd be absolutely fascinated to see the 3 most powerful men in the world at work. It would be great. I feel I've read a lot of accounts of it, but I want to be there behind the curtain listening in.
The few books I've read, 3 or 4 on Yalta, they're fascinating.
Yeah.
It really is. It's almost 19th century diplomacy.
That's a very good analogy. It really is. They were the most powerful men in the world, and they didn't have to, they could carve up the world without asking anyone. Fascinating stuff.
Last question. If you could have dinner with anyone living today, 2 hours off the record just to chat, whom would you choose?
Anyone living today? I think I wouldn't want to have dinner with him particularly, but I'd like to ask what the hell he's doing, and that's Putin. What are you playing at? Because when you look at Putin, I see history repeating itself. It's extraordinary. They're resurrecting statues of Stalin all over. Russia. It's mad. And invading the Ukraine and trying to get the raw materials and the coal mines and everything that Hitler was trying to get in the early 1940s. So it wouldn't be a pleasant dinner, and I'd hold off the vodka, but I would say, what the hell are you playing at here?
You have been listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast presented by Veteran Strategies, an Indiana-based public relations enterprise, and sponsored by Garmon Construction, Leaders and Legends LLC, the Grand Hall and Conference Center at Historic Union Station, and the McGinley's Golden Ace Inn. As always, all our podcast interviews are dedicated to the legacy and generosity of P.E. McAllister. Our guest today has been Giles Milton, author of, may I say, Crackling? Is that the word you use?
Yes, absolutely.
Book, The Stalin Affair, The Impossible Alliance That Won the War. Mr. Milton, thank you so much for your time today. Thank you for writing this book. It's just tremendous. I'm very grateful for your time, and I hope you come back on the podcast again.
Thanks so much for having me on. I will willingly come back.
Thank you very much for listening to Leaders and Legends, brought to you by Veteran Strategies Incorporated. If you want to contact us about this program or our menu of public relations services, please send us an email at robert@veteranstrategies.com. That's robert@veteranstrategies.com.